When 200 painted warriors surrounded his barn at dawn, weapons gleaming in the morning light, Shaw's first thought wasn't fear. It was humiliation, because the most feared gunslinger between Denver and the Rockies, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones, was about to be brought to his knees by an 8-year-old girl. But let's go back. Let's go back to where it all started just 24 hours earlier, when Shaw's legendary pride set him on a path that would cost him everything he thought he was. The Colorado sun was a merciless hammer that morning. It beat down on Shaw's lonely ranch, a patch of dirt and hope wedged between Pikes Peak and the edge of nowhere. At 34, Shaw had built his reputation on two things: his lightning-fast draw and his absolute refusal to show a single crack of weakness. Especially not to the Comanche, the ghost riders of the plains who controlled every pass and shadowed every valley. He was out by the creek, wrestling with a broken gate, the sweat stinging his eyes, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. A small figure. It stumbled across the edge of his property, moving in a drunken, unsteady zigzag toward the only thing that mattered out here: water. Shaw's hand didn't think, it just moved, resting on the worn handle of his Colt. 45. It was a reflex, as natural as breathing. But then he paused. The sun glinted off the figure, and it wasn't a threat. It was a child. Couldn't be more than 8 or 9 years old, draped in torn traditional garments that had seen far, far better days. Even from 100 yards out, Shaw could see it. The hunger. It was in every faltering step, a desperate, silent scream that the prairie winds seemed to carry right to him. Any other rancher in Colorado territory would have raised their rifle. They would have fired a warning shot, or maybe not a warning at all. Questions could wait until after the smoke cleared. The air between the settlers and the local Comanche tribes was a powder keg, primed and ready to blow. Raids and bloody counter-raids had painted the landscape with suspicion and fear for years. But Shaw had always been different, maybe too proud, maybe too stubborn to hate on command. He set down his hammer and pliers, the metal clinking softly in the vast silence. He started walking toward the child, his hands held out, visible, but his muscles were coiled, ready to draw if this was some kind of trick. He had to be sure. As he got closer, the details sharpened into a heart-wrenching picture. It was a little girl. Her dark eyes were huge, too big for a face carved down to the bone by starvation. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from a thirst that must have felt like swallowing fire. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw a collision of two powerful forces: absolute terror and raw desperation. It hit him harder than any fist ever could. The girl started speaking, a torrent of rapid Comanche words he couldn't understand, but her meaning was as clear as the mountain stream she was crawling toward. She was starving. Her small, trembling hands gestured toward her mouth, then toward the life-giving creek. It was a universal language of need, a plea that cut through every wall of culture and conflict. Shaw felt a familiar ghost on his shoulder. His reputation. He could almost hear the voices of his neighbors, Morris Tate and Jasper Lane, their scorn thick in the air. Helping a Comanche whelp, Shaw? Have you lost your mind? Then he looked back into those bottomless, desperate eyes, and in that single, silent moment, he made the decision that would shatter his pride, destroy his world, and nearly cost him his life. Without a single word, Shaw closed the distance, knelt down, and scooped the featherlight girl up into his powerful arms. He carried her toward his cabin, turning his back on the creek, on his broken fence, and on the simple, uncomplicated life he had known just minutes before. He had no idea that 20 miles away, a Comanche search party had just found her trail, and that trail was leading them straight to his front door. Inside his modest cabin, the air thick with the smell of pine wood and solitude, Shaw set the girl down gently on his only chair. She was so light, she felt like a bundle of dry sticks. He moved with an urgency he hadn't felt in years, his mind clear on one singular purpose: food. He had leftover venison stew from the night before, still warm on the back of the stove, and a half loaf of fresh cornbread he'd baked at dawn. The rich, savory smell seemed to fill the room, and for the first time, Shaw saw a flicker of something other than fear in the girl's eyes. It might have been hope. As he ladled the thick stew into a wooden bowl, his gaze fell on the girl's neck, and his blood ran cold. Partially hidden by her torn clothing, almost invisible against her skin, was a necklace. It wasn't just any necklace. The beadwork was intricate, a complex pattern of turquoise and obsidian that he'd seen before. Or at least, he'd heard it described in terrifying detail. His neighbor, Deputy Sheriff Morris Tate, had been talking about it just last week, his voice low and urgent, warning about a surge in Comanche activity. Those were not just beads. They were the ceremonial beads worn only by the direct family of Chief Iron Bear, the most powerful, the most feared, and the most ruthless Comanche leader in all of Colorado Territory. A man who was said to have a heart made of stone and a memory for vengeance that never, ever faded. Shaw's hand froze, the spoon hovering over the bowl. This wasn't just a hungry child. This was a stick of dynamite with a lit fuse. He was harboring the daughter of the one man who could bring 200 warriors down on his head without a second thought. His mind screamed at him to stop, to take her back out to the creek, point her in the direction of the mountains, and wash his hands of this whole mess. It was survival, but it was too late. The girl's thin, shaking hands were already reaching for the bowl. The smell of the food had reeled her in from the edge of oblivion, and Shaw looked at her fragile form and knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he couldn't turn her away. He couldn't do it. He handed her the bowl and the spoon, and he watched as she ate. She devoured the stew with a desperate, frantic hunger of someone who had been staring death in the face for days. Each spoonful was a victory against the grave. What Shaw didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the search party was closing in fast, and Chief Iron Bear himself was riding at its head. His face was a mask of cold fury and raw grief, a terrifying combination that promised nothing but fire and blood for whoever, or whatever, had taken his only daughter from him. The girl finished every last drop of the stew. She looked up at Shaw, and for a brief second her eyes held something that looked like gratitude. A silent thank you that felt heavier than a bag of gold. But as the afternoon shadows began to stretch like long, dark fingers across his property, Shaw couldn't shake the chilling feeling that had settled deep in his gut. He'd just made either the best decision of his life, or the very last one he would ever make. Within an hour, the girl was asleep in his chair, her small body finally surrendering to an exhaustion so profound it looked like death. Shaw gently covered her with his only wool blanket, his movements slow and careful, as if she were made of glass. He stood there for a long time, just watching her breathe, trying to convince himself he'd done the right thing. But as dusk began to bleed across the sky, that conviction started to crumble like dry riverbed clay. That's when he heard it. The unmistakable sound of hoofbeats drumming against the hard-packed dirt road. Fast. Urgent. Shaw's stomach plunged. He peered through the grimy glass of his window and saw 3 riders pushing their horses hard, coming straight for his cabin. He recognized them instantly, his neighbor, the perpetually agitated Jasper Lane. And flanking him were 2 other men from town. Deputy Sheriff Morris Tate and the local preacher, a man whose piety was only matched by his fear of conflict. Shaw was outside before they could even dismount, his hand raised in a gesture he hoped would keep their voices down. He didn't want them waking the girl, but it was too late. Jasper was already shouting, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and raw panic. "Shaw, you damned fool! What in the hell are you thinking?" Jasper's face was beet red, his eyes wide with a fear that looked terrifyingly genuine. "Morris here says he saw smoke signals coming from the hills this afternoon. The Comanche are looking for something, or someone. Deputy Morris dismounted, his face a grim, stony mask. He didn't waste time on greetings. Word came down from the fort. Chief Iron Bear's daughter went missing 3 days ago, vanished during a hunting party. The story is, she wandered off and got caught in that big storm. He paused, and his eyes, sharp and calculating, bored into Shaw's. You wouldn't happen to know anything about a missing Comanche girl, now would you, Shaw? Shaw felt his throat tighten, the air suddenly turning to sand. The smart play was to lie. To play dumb, send them on their way, and buy himself time to figure this out on his own. But these men, for all their faults, had been his neighbors for years. He knew their families. He'd shared drinks with them, and beneath the panic, he could see they were here out of a real, if misguided, concern for him. She's inside, Shaw said, his voice barely a whisper. Half-starved and exhausted. I found her by the creek. He added, his voice gaining a bit of its old steel. I couldn't just leave her to die. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. The only sound was the heaving of the horses and the chirping of crickets, completely oblivious to the human drama unfolding. The preacher was the first to break it, his voice hushed, as if he were delivering a eulogy. Son, do you have any idea what you've done? I helped a hungry child, Shaw shot back, but even to his own ears, the words sounded dangerously naive, like a child's answer to a grown man's problem. Jasper started pacing, a caged animal, running his hands through his already wild hair. They're gonna think you took her, Shaw. Hell, they probably already do. Iron Bear has been known to wipe out entire settlements for less than this, for a stolen horse. Deputy Morris was already backing toward his mount, his decision made. His face was pale in the fading light. I have to report this, Shaw. It's my duty, but I'll give you a head start. He swung himself into the saddle, his movements jerky and hurried. Get her back to her people, now, before they find you here with her. In the dark? Shaw asked, a cold dread washing over him. She can barely walk 2 steps. And how in God's name am I supposed to approach a Comanche camp at night without getting shot full of arrows before I get 10 feet? Morris gathered his reins, his expression devoid of sympathy. That's your problem now. He spurred his horse, not even looking back. I'm riding to town to warn everyone else. If Iron Bear decides to make an example of you, he might not stop at just your ranch. As the 3 men galloped away, their hoofbeats fading into the encroaching darkness, Shaw stood alone, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical blow. He listened to the girl's quiet, even breathing from inside the cabin, a sound of peace in a world that was about to erupt in war. He thought about saddling his horse, trying to find the Comanche camp in the treacherous, unfamiliar hills. It was suicide. He thought about loading her into his wagon and making a desperate run for the nearest town. But that would just bring the tribe's wrath down on hundreds of innocent people. The cold, hard truth settled over him. There was no good way out of this. Every path, every option, led to the exact same place. A face-to-face confrontation with one of the most feared war chiefs in the entire Colorado Territory. And as if summoned by his very thoughts, a new sound began to drift across the plains. A low, distant rhythm, the sound of war drums, and they were getting closer with every single terrifying beat. Shaw's blood turned to ice. They weren't waiting for morning. The Comanche were coming, and they were coming tonight. Shaw scrambled back into the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The war drums were no longer a distant whisper. They were a thunderous, rolling heartbeat that seemed to shake the very foundations of his small home. He could make out the individual beats now. Slow, methodical, unrelenting. This wasn't the chaotic noise of a simple raiding party looking for cattle. This was something else entirely, something far more organized and infinitely more dangerous. This was the sound of an army on the march. The girl stirred in the chair, the rhythmic pounding pulling her from the depths of her exhausted sleep. Her eyes snapped open, wide with a terror that was ancient and instinctive. For the first time since he'd found her, Shaw saw pure, undiluted recognition on her face. She knew what those drums meant far better than he did. She leaped from the chair, the blanket pooling at her feet, and began speaking in a rush of frantic Comanche. She pointed a trembling finger toward the door, then stabbed it back at herself, her eyes pleading with him to understand. Even without the words, her panic was a language all its own. She was trying to tell him something vital, something urgent, but the barrier between their tongues was a chasm he couldn't cross. Shaw knelt beside her, forcing his own voice to remain calm, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. "I know you can't understand me, little one," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I'm trying to help you. Those drums. That's your people, isn't it? They're coming for you." The girl nodded vigorously, a sharp, jerky motion. Then she did something that chilled him to the bone. She grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands, her grip surprisingly strong, and dragged him toward the window. She pointed out into the star-dusted darkness. Then she held up both her hands, fingers splayed, and opened and closed them. Again, and again, and again. Shaw counted along with her desperate gestures. 10, 20, 30. She didn't stop. 40, 50, 100. She kept going, her movements becoming more frantic, until she had flashed her hands 20 times. 200. Shaw's legs felt like they were about to give out from under him. He leaned against the wall for support. 200 warriors. He had been bracing himself for a dozen angry braves, a war party he might, with some luck, be able to reason with. But 200? That wasn't a war party. That was an army of vengeance. Enough men to level every ranch for 50 miles and salt the earth behind them. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the drums stopped. The silence that crashed down in their wake was somehow 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a loaded, waiting silence. The breath held before the scream. Shaw crept back to the window, his own breathing seeming deafeningly loud in the quiet cabin. He peered out into the darkness, his eyes straining to see past the familiar shapes of his own property. At first, there was nothing, just the vast empty plains under a sliver of moon. Then he saw them. Like ghosts rising from the earth itself, shapes began to materialize out of the night. They moved with a silent, deadly grace, a flowing river of darkness. Warriors on horseback, spreading out in a wide, perfect semicircle that was slowly, inexorably, tightening around his cabin. Even in the faint moonlight, he could see the glint of war paint on their faces. He could see the stark silhouette of feathers in their hair, the long, lethal lines of lances and bows in their hands. These were not men who had come to talk. The girl tugged on his sleeve again, her touch electric with fear. She gestured toward herself, then made a sharp, definitive motion toward the door. She wanted to go to them, but would that help? Or would it just make everything catastrophically worse? What if they saw a strange white man pushing her out the door? What if they didn't believe for a second that she had come to him willingly? A single voice cut through the night, startlingly close. It spoke in English, the accent heavy, but the words were perfectly, chillingly clear. "White man, we know you have taken something that belongs to us." The voice paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Send out the girl, and perhaps you will live to see the morning." Shaw's mouth was as dry as dust. He took a half-step toward the door, his mind a whirlwind of impossible choices. But the girl grabbed his arm, her grip like a vice. She shook her head frantically, her eyes wide with a new, more specific terror. She pointed at herself. Then she drew her small finger across her own throat, in a gesture that was universally, horrifyingly understood. She was trying to warn him. But about what? That they would kill him? He already knew that. Then it hit him. A flash of insight so brutal it felt like a physical blow. She wasn't just warning him about his own death. She was warning him about something far more complex. The necklace. The family of the chief. This wasn't just Chief Iron Bear's daughter. This was his only daughter. In Comanche culture, that made her more than just a child. She was the future. The continuation of a sacred bloodline. If anything had happened to her while she was under Shaw's roof, even if he was completely blameless, Iron Bear would have no choice. He would be culturally bound to exact a vengeance so terrible, so complete, that no other settler would ever dare to even look at a Comanche child again. Shaw realized with a wave of sickening horror that saving the girl's life might have been the easy part. Now he had to prove it. He had to prove to 200 armed, grieving, and furious warriors that he had saved her, not stolen her. And he had about 30 seconds to figure out how to do that before Chief Iron Bear lost what little patience he had left and turned Shaw's entire world into a slaughterhouse. He took a deep breath, unlocked the cabin door, and stepped outside into the moonlight, his hands raised high above his head. The girl followed close behind him, a small shadow clinging to his leg. The sight that greeted him was something torn from the pages of his worst nightmares. 200 Comanche warriors sat perfectly still on their horses, forming a flawless, suffocating circle around his property. War paint, stark and terrifying in the moonlight, seemed to absorb the light, and every single weapon, every lance, every bow, every rifle, was pointed directly at his chest. At the head of the formation, sitting on a massive black warhorse, was a man who could only be Chief Iron Bear. He was immense, a figure of raw power and authority. Silver streaked through his long black hair, and his eyes, even from a distance, seemed to burn with a barely contained fury that could set the whole prairie ablaze. The girl broke away from Shaw and ran toward her father, calling out a single word in Comanche. But the joyful, tearful reunion Shaw had expected never happened. Instead, Iron Bear's expression grew even darker, his face hardening into a mask of granite. The chief dismounted with a fluid, dangerous grace. He knelt beside his daughter, his eyes scanning every inch of her, examining her as she spoke in a rapid, breathless torrent, gesturing back toward Shaw and the cabin. Shaw couldn't understand a single word, but he was an expert in reading body language, and the chief's was screaming one thing: violence. Every muscle in Iron Bear's powerful frame was coiled like a rattlesnake, ready to strike without warning. Whatever his daughter was telling him, it wasn't making things better. It was making them worse. Finally, Iron Bear stood to his full, intimidating height. He began to walk toward Shaw with slow, deliberate, predatory steps. The other warriors remained mounted, but a ripple of movement went through them. They shifted their weapons, a subtle adjustment that created a sound like 1,000 dry leaves skittering across stone. It was the sound of an army preparing to act on a single command. "My daughter tells me you fed her," Iron Bear said. His English was precise, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. "She tells me you gave her shelter." He stopped just out of arm's reach, close enough that Shaw could see the network of intricate pale scars that crisscrossed the chief's bare chest. Marks of countless battles won and enemies utterly defeated. "Yes," Shaw replied, his voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the terror that was clawing at his insides. "She was starving. I couldn't let a child die on my land." Iron Bear studied him for a long, silent moment, his dark eyes seeming to strip Shaw bare, to see right into his soul. "She also tells me," the chief continued, his voice dropping even lower, "that you saw the sacred beads of our family around her neck. You knew who she was, yet you did not immediately try to return her to us." Shaw's heart sank. This was it, the pivot point, the moment where this all went horribly, catastrophically wrong. I was going to, Shaw said, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. I was going to bring her back in the morning. She was too weak to travel tonight. She would have died out there. Perhaps, Iron Bear said, the word hanging in the air like a death sentence. Or perhaps you thought to keep her, a prize, to trade her back to us for cattle or horses, or for safe passage through our lands. The accusation was a physical thing, pressing in on Shaw from all sides. He could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on him, 200 warriors just waiting, begging for their chief's signal to turn this tense conversation into a one-sided massacre. That's not true, Shaw said, his voice ringing with a sincerity born of desperation. I never wanted anything from you. I swear on my life. I just couldn't watch a child suffer. Iron Bear's face remained an unreadable mask. He raised his hand. In perfect, terrifying unison, every warrior drew back their bowstring. The sound of 200 arrows being knocked at once was the most horrifying sound Shaw had ever heard. It was the sound of death itself taking a sharp, expectant breath. You will prove your words, the chief said, his voice a deadly quiet whisper that carried across the entire clearing. Or you will die where you stand. Shaw's mind raced, a frantic search for an escape that didn't exist. He stared at the sea of glinting arrow points, each one aimed at his heart. How? How do you prove your intentions? How do you prove goodness to a man who has seen nothing but greed and evil from your kind for his entire life? Then, an idea, a long shot, a desperate gamble. Inspiration struck him like a bolt of lightning. Your daughter was wearing this when I found her, Shaw said slowly, his voice calm, deliberate. He reached into his trouser pocket. Every warrior tensed, bowstrings strained, fingers tightened on triggers. Shaw moved with excruciating slowness, pulling out a small, dirty piece of torn fabric. It was a piece of the girl's original garment that had caught and ripped off on his fence post when she'd stumbled onto his property. I kept it, Shaw said, holding it out on his open palm. I thought you might want proof. Proof that I didn't harm her, that she came to me in peace. Iron Bear took the small scrap of fabric. He examined it in the moonlight, and for the first time a flicker of something, recognition, crossed his stoic features. It was, indeed, from his daughter's ceremonial dress, the one she had been wearing when she disappeared into the storm. She came to my water source, Shaw continued, his voice growing stronger, more confident. He was no longer a victim. He was a man telling his truth. I could have driven her away. I could have shot her as a trespasser, and no law in this territory would have convicted me for it. He locked eyes with the chief. Instead, I carried her into my home. I gave her my own food, from my own plate. I covered her with my own blanket. And I asked for nothing in return. The girl suddenly spoke up, her small voice cutting through the thick tension. She tugged on her father's arm, pointing with urgency back toward the cabin. She ran to the door and beckoned for him to follow her inside. Iron Bear hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, with a curt, almost imperceptible nod, he motioned for Shaw to accompany them. Inside the small, sparsely furnished cabin, the girl became the sole storyteller. She pointed to the chair where she had slept, the wool blanket still pooled on the seat. She pointed to the empty wooden bowl on the table, still stained with the remnants of the venison stew. She mimed the act of eating, of her head drooping with sleep, and then she pointed a small, steady finger at Shaw. And she smiled. The first genuine, unforced smile he had seen from her. A smile of pure, uncomplicated gratitude. But Iron Bear's attention wasn't on his daughter's pantomime. His gaze was fixed on something else entirely. On the rough-hewn table, next to the empty bowl, sat Shaw's most prized and painful possession. A small, faded, tintype photograph of his own family. His wife, Betty, and their young son, both taken from him by a cholera outbreak 3 years prior. The picture was worn at the edges from years of handling, and it was surrounded by a small ring of dried wildflowers that Shaw picked and replaced every single week. A ritual of remembrance, a conversation with ghosts. "You have lost children, too," Iron Bear said. The words were not a question, they were a statement, and for the first time since he had arrived, the chief's voice held something other than cold, hard anger. It held a trace of a shared, universal pain. "My boy," Shaw replied, his own throat suddenly tight with grief. He was about her age. He looked from the photograph to the girl, and the truth of his actions became clear even to himself. Maybe that's why I couldn't turn her away. Iron Bear reached out and picked up the photograph, his calloused warrior's fingers surprisingly gentle as he held the small metal plate. He studied the smiling faces of Shaw's lost family, his expression unreadable. Outside, the 200 warriors maintained their silent, deadly positions. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. The air was still thick with tension, but it was no longer the hair-trigger tension of impending violence. It was something else, something more complex. The girl continued chattering away in Comanche, her story tumbling out, apparently filling in every detail of how Shaw had found her, carried her, and cared for her. "She says you could have taken advantage," Iron Bear translated, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "A lone white man with a helpless Comanche child. You could have demanded a great ransom. You could have used her as a shield, as protection against my people." He looked up, his gaze meeting Shaw's. "Instead, you simply fed her, and you let her rest." Shaw nodded slowly. "I've got no quarrel with your people, Chief. I just work my land and try to live in peace." Iron Bear was quiet for a long, heavy moment, still holding the photograph of the family Shaw would never see again. When he finally spoke, his words were so unexpected they stunned everyone, including his own daughter. "My warriors expected to find a kidnapper tonight," he said, his voice low. "They expected to burn this place to the ground and take your scalp back to our village as proof of our justice." He carefully, almost reverently, set the photograph back down on the table, exactly where he had found it. "Instead," he said, turning to face Shaw fully, "we find a man who showed kindness to a child who should have been his enemy." A fragile flicker of hope ignited in Shaw's chest. He had done it. He had bridged the gap. He had survived. But then he heard it. A restless, agitated stirring from the warriors outside. 200 men had ridden out here tonight primed for blood and vengeance, and now their chief was inside this cabin talking about kindness. That kind of profound disappointment, Shaw knew, could curdle into a different, more unpredictable kind of violence very, very quickly. "But there is still a problem," Iron Bear continued, his voice hardening once more. And just like that, Shaw's hope crumbled into dust. "My warriors cannot return to their families empty-handed," the chief stated, his words as final as a gravestone. "They cannot tell their wives and children that we rode out to punish a great crime, and that we came back with nothing but words." Shaw's blood turned cold. What are you saying?" "I am saying," Iron Bear explained, his face grim, "that even though you meant no harm, you have created a situation that demands a resolution. My people expected justice tonight, a public justice." He gestured toward the cabin door, where the low murmur outside was escalating into angry, agitated voices. "And if they do not get it, some of my younger, more hot-blooded warriors believe that any white man who touches a Comanche child, for any reason, must pay the price in blood. They think I am being weak by talking instead of fighting." As if on cue, a single angry voice shouted something in Comanche from outside. The shout was picked up by other voices, a growing chorus of rage. Shaw couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were calling for his death. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will determine everything. Iron Bear looked Shaw directly in the eyes, his own face a mask of conflict. "There is only one way to satisfy both justice and honor tonight," he said, his voice grave. "But it will require something from you that may be harder and more painful than simply dying." Before Shaw could even process the chief's cryptic warning, the cabin door burst open. A warrior with a face defined by a web of terrifying scars, a man who radiated pure, undiluted rage, stepped directly into Iron Bear's path. His scarred face was twisted in a furious snarl as he spoke rapidly in Comanche, his voice rising with each word, spitting venom. Shaw didn't need a translation. This was a direct, public challenge. Iron Bear's response was quiet but firm, his authority a rock against the warrior's wave of fury. Shaw watched, a helpless bystander, as the two men faced off. Chief against warrior. Authority against grief-fueled anger. The future of the tribe being decided right here in his tiny cabin. The girl pressed closer to Shaw's side, and he could feel her small body trembling. Outside, the carefully maintained discipline of the war party was shattering. Warriors began to shift, to choose sides. Some moved their horses to form up behind the scarred warrior, their faces set and grim. Others remained loyal to their chief, but their uncertainty was palpable. The fragile peace was fracturing, and Shaw realized with a sickening lurch that he was about to witness a civil war ignite, with his own life as the spark. The scarred warrior jabbed a lance in Shaw's direction and shouted something that made several of the other warriors nod in savage agreement. Iron Bear's jaw tightened. When he spoke again, his voice was dangerously low, carrying the unmistakable tone of a final, deadly warning. But the scarred warrior wasn't backing down. He was too far gone, too committed. He took another step forward, so close now that the razor-sharp point of his lance was almost touching Iron Bear's chest. The challenge was as clear as a lightning strike in a summer sky. Follow the old ways, blood for blood, or be seen as a weak, soft chief by the new generation of warriors. That's when the girl did something no one, least of all Shaw, could have ever expected. She let go of Shaw's leg, stepped directly between the two powerful, angry men, and began to speak. Her voice, though young, was clear and strong, cutting through the thick, hateful tension like a sharpened knife. She spoke in rapid, passionate Comanche, her eyes fixed on the scarred warrior. And Shaw watched, mesmerized, as the warrior's expression began to shift. The raw rage slowly gave way to confusion, then to surprise, and then, finally, to something that looked a lot like shame. Iron Bear translated quietly, his voice filled with a new and profound respect. She is telling them exactly what happened, how she was lost in the storm, how she wandered for days without food or water, how she was ready to lie down and die alone on the prairie, until you found her. The girl kept speaking, her voice growing stronger, more confident with every word. She pointed at Shaw, then at herself. She mimed eating the stew, sleeping in the chair, the blanket being draped over her. She was telling the story of her rescue, not as a victim, but as a witness. And even the warriors who had been ready to follow the scarred man into battle were listening now, their anger being replaced by a grudging curiosity. Finally, the scarred warrior spoke. His voice, once a roar of rage, was now barely a whisper. Iron Bear's translation came slowly, each word weighed with significance. He says that perhaps the Great Spirit sent his brother a teacher tonight, instead of an enemy. He paused, his eyes finding Shaw's. He says that, maybe. Maybe wisdom sometimes comes from the smallest voices. Shaw felt the air in the room change. The crushing pressure in his chest seemed to ease just a little. The tension wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but it had transformed into something else. Uncertainty, the dawning of a new, unexpected possibility. Iron Bear looked at Shaw, and for the first time, Shaw saw something in the chief's eyes that looked like genuine respect. "My daughter has just done something remarkable," he said. "She has turned a war party into a council meeting." He took a deep breath, the weight of leadership settling back onto his shoulders. But now comes the hardest part. "What's that?" Shaw asked, his voice hoarse. "Now," the chief said, his gaze intense, "you must prove to all of them that her faith in you was justified." He gestured toward the cabin door, toward the circle of now silent warriors. "Tonight, in our village, in front of the elders who have spent their entire lives seeing your people as nothing but enemies." He turned and strode toward the door, stopping at the threshold and looking back at Shaw. "Are you ready to bet your life on the word of a child?" Shaw looked down at the girl. She was watching him with those same huge, desperate eyes that had started this whole impossible ordeal. But this time, he realized, she wasn't begging for his help. She was offering him hers, and somehow, that made all the difference in the world. The ride to the Comanche village was a 3-hour journey through a world Shaw had never known existed. They moved through hidden canyons and along secret, moonlit paths that his people, in all their years of mapping and exploring, had never discovered. This was their land, their sanctuary, and he was being led into its very heart. As they approached the main camp, Shaw saw the flickering orange glow of dozens of fires lighting up the darkness. He could hear the low, rolling murmur of hundreds of voices as word of their strange procession spread like wildfire through the village. A white man, alive, riding beside their chief. The tribal council was convened immediately, despite the late hour. 7 elders, their faces like ancient weathered maps of a long and difficult history, sat in a solemn semicircle around a large central fire. The dancing shadows made their grave expressions seem even more severe. Shaw was made to stand in the center of the circle, alone. He was acutely, uncomfortably aware that he was almost certainly the first white man to ever enter this sacred space and have even a sliver of a chance of leaving it alive. Iron Bear spoke first, his voice resonating with authority as he explained the strange circumstances of his daughter's rescue. Then, the scarred warrior stepped forward. Despite his earlier change of heart, his grief was still a raw wound, and he argued passionately for the traditional justice his heart demanded. An eye for an eye. The debate raged back and forth in Comanche, a complex and powerful river of words that Shaw could not understand. He stood silently, a statue in the firelight, catching nothing but the occasional angry gesture in his direction. It felt like hours. It felt like a lifetime. Finally, the girl stepped forward again. This time her voice wasn't passionate or frantic. It was calm, measured, but her words carried the undeniable weight of absolute conviction. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, her gaze never wavering, moving from one elder's face to the next. She held the attention of every person in that village. When she finished, a profound silence fell over the council. The oldest member, an ancient man whose hair was as white as winter snow, leaned forward. His voice was cracked with age, but it held a power that commanded respect. He asked her a single question in Comanche. Her answer was immediate, unwavering. Iron Bear turned to Shaw, his face impossible to read in the flickering light. He asked her, the chief translated, his voice a low whisper, if she truly believes you would risk your life to save another Comanche child, even after tonight, knowing what it could cost you. What did she say? Shaw breathed. She said yes, Iron Bear replied, without a moment's hesitation. The 7 elders conferred among themselves, their heads close together, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. Shaw's heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down the final moments of his life. He waited for their judgment, knowing that these next few seconds would determine whether he saw another sunrise. The white-haired elder stood up slowly, his old joints creaking with the effort. He raised a frail, gnarled hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 100 winters. Iron Bear translated, "He says that the spirits have sent us a test tonight, not a test of our strength in war, but a test of our wisdom, a test of our ability to recognize when an act of mercy deserves mercy in return." Shaw felt his knees go weak with a relief so profound it was almost painful. But the elder wasn't finished. "You will be granted safe passage back to your land," Iron Bear continued, translating the elder's decree. "But you will be granted more than that. From this night forward, you will be granted the protection of our tribe. Any Comanche who harms you, or your property, will have to answer to this council." Shaw was speechless. He could barely form words. I don't know what to say." "There is one condition," the elder continued, his voice echoing through the silent village. "You must promise that if any of our people ever come to you in need, hungry, wounded, or lost, you will show them the same kindness you showed this child." "I promise," Shaw said, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't have to think about it for a second. "I promise." What happened next surprised everyone, most of all Shaw. The girl, who had stood with such quiet dignity, suddenly ran to him. She threw her small arms around his waist and hugged him with all her might. She looked up at him, her dark eyes shining in the firelight, and spoke in broken, halting English for the very first time. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving me." She squeezed him tighter. "Now, I save you." As the first hints of dawn broke over the Colorado mountains, Shaw rode back to his ranch. But this time, he did not ride alone in fear. He rode with an escort of honor, a silent testament to the impossible events of the night. The two cultures, which had stood on the very brink of a bloody, devastating war, had instead found a bridge. And that bridge had been built by one lonely cowboy's simple act of kindness. Shaw's ranch, once a symbol of his isolation, became neutral ground, a place where Comanche and settlers could meet, trade, and talk in safety. He never got rich, he never became famous outside that hidden valley, but he lived the rest of his long life with the quiet, profound knowledge that sometimes the smallest acts of mercy are all that stand between us and the greatest of tragedies. And every year, on the anniversary of that terrifying night, a young Comanche woman, no longer a starving, lost child, but a respected and wise leader of her tribe, would visit Shaw's ranch. They would share a meal, and they would remember the moment when two worlds chose understanding over warfare. The girl who had once begged for a scrap of food became a renowned translator and a peacemaker, her voice carrying the wisdom of both her peoples. Shaw lived to be 73, dying peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by friends from both cultures. Friends who had learned from him that true courage isn't always about how you fight. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stop and simply feed a hungry child instead. And hey, if you enjoyed that story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss any of the incredible stories we have coming your way.